Our resident lawyer, Despina Priala of boutique law firm Priala Legal in Runaway Bay, with us each and every Thursday. She's here to offer her legal expertise by providing general advice on the latest hot topics. She has experience spanning more than 25 years in the area, property and commercial law, and she's with us once again this morning. Morning to you, Despina.
Good morning, Wayne. Good morning, Brooke.
Good morning, Des. So first up, mandating the COVID-19 vaccine. What should employers consider before doing this, or even if they're thinking of doing this? It's a minefield because SPC just mandated it and now it's sparked all these questions. So, Despina, what do you think?
It is a minefield. And I think the first thing to say is that employers should think very carefully before starting to put out and mandating that their employees need to be vaccinated. And I say that for specific reasons, because first of all, we don't have any laws that mandate this, only in specific industries, which we'll talk about in a minute. So we have public health orders that have been issued, our public health orders and directions under the Public Health Act, where employers have to take lawful and reasonable measures generally, but there is nothing there yet to say that employees must have the COVID vaccine. A couple of exceptions, of course, we have seen that there has been mandatory requirements seen for the aged care workers in the aged care industry. So we've seen that, and I think the first dose has to now be given or taken by employees in those industries by the September due date now. So whilst we have a goal by the Australian government, as we can see, that they want as many people to be vaccinated, it is not yet mandatory, and there are no mandatory laws across the board. So it's becoming more difficult for employers to deal with what is happening out there in society, because they're juggling a lot of balls. They're juggling compliance with public health orders, and we've seen that with having people sign in using QR codes and face masks that have to be worn. And now we're moving towards a potential mandatory vaccine situation in the workplace. So you've got employers having to juggle public health directions and orders, but you've also got employers that have to juggle a bunch of legislation that as employers they've got to make sure that they comply with and they don't breach. So what I'm talking about is particular things such as the Sex Discrimination Act, the Age Discrimination Act and the Disability Discrimination Act, which some employers might forget about or not really understand that these are in place for a reason. So for example, if there was a law that came into force that mandated COVID-19 vaccinations, it may indirectly engage discrimination laws, where you just say a blanket, all employees, regardless of age, sex, disability, or other medical condition, are now required to take the vaccine. So you can imagine that could cause quite an uproar, potential problems in the workplace.
Yeah, there are certainly plenty of reasons, I think, that employees might have an issue with this. Now, what I find interesting already, you mentioned SPC, of course, which is a big public company, but the government is having trouble with this in terms of implementing mandatory vaccines. So if the government's having trouble with it, you can imagine how small businesses are going to find this just so difficult.
They're going to find it very difficult. And the reason is that the Australian government is placing the burden on employers. So they're basically saying, well, we've got some public health directions and orders that you have to comply with. You've got other laws and a bunch of laws, state and federal, that employers also have to be wary of and understand as employers what they have to make sure that they comply with. But basically, the burden is on employers to use their judgment and discretion with these laws that have been issued, like the public health directions that have been issued, particularly because these public health directions are not really black and white. So it's difficult for employers to navigate these waters because we're not dealing with a black and white law. We're dealing with, in a lot of cases, employers having to take have the decision-making responsibility put on themselves to determine what is best for my workplace. Am I being lawful and reasonable in putting out there mandating vaccinations for all my staff if I was going to do that? They have to now sit back and consider carefully, if I do this, am I being lawful and reasonable? And what do they have to use as a benchmark to determine that? And that's why it's difficult for employers to have this burden, as you can easily see. So you've got employers having to juggle with, well, I don't want to have any unfair dismissal claims against me, do I? Or potential claims if I'm seen to be discriminatory on a range of issues, such as if I have staff who are pregnant, if I have staff who have a disability, if I have staff who have other medical conditions that I don't take into consideration, if I just mandate everybody in the workplace has to be vaccinated now. Well, that's, a little bit of a dangerous territory if you haven't carefully considered those issues, such as do you have employees in any one of those categories where you might be seen as being discriminatory against them, whether it's basis on sex, age or disability or other medical condition.
Yeah, and even health as well. I know that when I sign up to a job, I'm like, here's my medical history, so you know what's going on. They're rolling this out to people with God knows what going on. And then on the other hand, religion, that's another huge one that's coming up, and a lot of people don't agree with that. So
religion is a huge issue, and that's really not the same as potential discrimination on the basis of sex, age or disability either. So that's a very different area altogether, and you really have to be careful there. But probably what a lot of people aren't aware of is that there already have been 3 cases determined this year by the Fair Work Commissioner on this very issue about whether it was fair for an employer to dismiss an employee who refused to have the vaccine. Yes, and so we've already had 3 cases determined. So perhaps people aren't aware of that. But what I'd say about that, if employers are listening, and employees, of course, is that these 3 cases were in high-risk category industries. So it wasn't a blanket decision that could easily be used by any business proprietor in any industry to then use that to say, okay, well, this employee took the employer to the commissioner for unfair dismissal, and it was an unfair dismissal. Therefore, the employer won. Therefore, every employer around town could then mandate vaccines. It's not as easy as that. Not going to
work like that, yeah.
Yeah, so
it was limited to aged care industry and childcare industries specifically for these 3 cases, where the employer did win in that they were not found to have unfairly dismissed those employees in those specific cases.
Okay, and say for the smaller businesses, maybe they have staff that interact with the public regularly and they're trying to make this really, or want to make this difficult decision, how would you suggest they go about it?
They need to get advice, really carefully considered advice as well before they start mandating, because I can say this, that each case, if it went before the Fair Work Commission in relation to an unfair dismissal claim where an employer just put out a blanket, all staff has to be vaccinated, and if you don't vaccinate, then they're dismissed, you need to understand that the commissioner will take each case and assess each case on its individual facts and circumstances. So there is no one answer to all proprietors out there in business, and that's very important to understand. From the cases determined already, if you're in aged care or if you're in childcare, yes, you could probably use those cases determined so far to assist you.
Yep.
But if you're not in those industries, for example, SPC or other businesses, you need to be really careful that you've actually done your homework, you've got a reasonable basis to support any decision you make in the workplace, that you've made a reasonable and lawful decision and direction to mandate vaccines.
Well, as you've mentioned, there's already been 3 cases through the Fair Work Commission so far, but there's going to be a whole stack more, aren't there?
Absolutely, 100%. And the other factors really that the employers need to consider. So these are the really practical issues. If you've got a business and you're thinking, well, do I or don't I? You've got to consider, like I said, would a vaccination direction be discriminatory? Is there an option to work remotely? So you've got an employee that says, I'm not taking the vaccine. Well, can they work remotely then? And should you be giving them the option? So this is very important to consider. So another thing that they should be taking into account is, can an employee still work, but other measures are taken in relation to an employee who doesn't want to be vaccinated? For example, physical distancing, wearing face masks. So those measures, is that enough in a particular workplace So you don't have to mandate vaccination. So these are the things that, or some of the things that employers should really be considering when making those decisions.
Yeah, fantastic advice there from Despina Priala from Priala Legal. Next up, we'll be talking about the no-fault vaccine injury compensation scheme that could possibly be rolling out soon. More Talking Law is coming up next. Don't go anywhere.